This is EWA Radio, the official podcast of the Education Writers Association, and I'm public editor Emily Richmond. In a handful of states across the country, students are learning about race and ethnicity, how it impacts their own lives, their learning, and their future opportunities. This is not critical race theory. Instead, it's a long-standing educational model known as ethnic studies, in which teachers help students understand the experiences and histories of ethnic groups that are typically underrepresented in other parts of a traditional school curriculum. Longtime education journalist Linda K. Wertheimer went deep into this realm for a cover story for the Boston Globe Sunday magazine. It's a project that was supported in part by an EWA reporting fellowship. Linda, welcome back to EWA Radio.
Thank you so much, Emily. It's great to be here again.
Just for our listeners who may not be familiar with it, can you give us a quick description of what an ethnic studies program is?
Yes, I'll try to make it quick because I think I wrote about 3 paragraphs about it in my story. So generally it's a class, and it's a class that looks at both the history of oppression of racial and ethnic groups in the United States and the history of resistance that these groups did. So social movements as well. Another aspect, and I think you kind of captured it in your intro, is that it looks at the lived experiences of the students themselves. So a lot of the classes will begin with looking at the student's own identity. And just to add, like when we're talking about racial and ethnic groups, the groups in the room, but in general, African American, Native American, Asian American, and Latino as well.
Why was this a story you wanted to tell?
I had been writing about teaching about race and racism for a very long time. And I got interested in ethnic studies originally when I was doing a Spencer Fellowship at Columbia and was looking at the history. And I was just fascinated by what had happened in Tucson in the 1990s. You know, they had started their ethnic studies program and a lot of controversy built over it. But I was also fascinated because there had been research studies on this that said it actually made a difference for the students it served. And so much in education, we never see any sort of qualitative research. So I think I was really fascinated to see what I could do myself. And I was hearing that Boston was going to start doing more in ethnic studies as well. So that all sort of got me going on this.
But the origin story of ethnic studies is actually in higher education, is that right?
Yes, 100% correct. Though if you ask a historian, they would also say that what teachers did in the freedom schools, even like 4 years before that, was kind of like ethnic studies. But yes, the founding of ethnic studies, and I'm putting quotes around it, is linked to the 1968-69 student strike at San Francisco State College's campus. And I don't know how much you know about the history of that. It started with Black students who really wanted themselves to be more represented on campus. And then it became this whole coalition of racial and ethnic groups on the campus. They were lobbying to see themselves better represented both in enrollment on campus and in the classes offered. And one of the outcomes of that was the creation of the College of Ethnic Studies. And it started programs in 4 different areas: African American, Native American, Asian American, and Latino American studies. And out of that really grew this whole field of ethnic studies.
How did it spread to the K-12 level? And we should say this is predominantly at high schools.
Yes, predominantly at high schools, though you can definitely find examples of ethnic studies classes in some middle schools as well. And there even now are elementary teachers trying some of this too, but primarily high school is correct. So the first high school known to do widespread teaching of ethnic studies is actually Berkeley High School in California. And it also was the first to approve a graduation requirement of one ethnic studies course in 1990. But based on my research too, I was hearing like people who graduated from San Francisco State and had studied ethnic studies, some of them went into teaching. So I could see some teacher out there raising their hand and say, but hey, I was doing this a few years after the strike. But there really wasn't systematic teaching of ethnic studies in any school systems until at least 1990.
How did you end up focusing on Holyoke, Massachusetts?
Stroke of luck. We really wanted, when I say we, my editor and I had talked about the project and really wanted to have a strong Massachusetts presence, given we are a Boston-based paper. And originally we thought that would be Boston. but they weren't far enough along. That was one reason. Also, because of the pandemic, they weren't allowing reporters in the classrooms. So I was doing some research to try and find out, does anybody else in Massachusetts do this? And found a 2-pager about Holyoke's program buried in something on the state education department website about culturally responsive teaching. And it said they had had ethnic studies for like 8 years. I was like, wow. And also, I was really interested in Holyoke because I knew it was a district in state receivership. So that was a couple of things. And then I guess one more aspect, what made Holyoke really, really interesting is about 80% of the school district is of Puerto Rican heritage. So there was just a lot of interesting elements there.
Tell us what the ethnic studies program looks like in Holyoke. If I'm registering my kid in that school and I show up, are they going to explain it to me right off the bat?
No, not really. I mean, my understanding is it just kind of appears. um, so when they started ethnic studies in Holyoke, it began in the middle school level and in 8th grade, and then they went down to 7th grade and up to high school. And all of the 7th and 8th graders were actually getting some form of ethnic studies mixed in with history classes and possibly English. I'm not sure about that. But the high school, they started that just a little bit later. And at one high school, the Dean campus, beginning in 2018, all students, they take as their freshman history class, it is history ethnic studies. And at one of the other high school campuses, Holyoke High North, it's been an elective. So students choose, but I don't get the sense that there's a whole bunch of education to the parents about this. It's the students who find out about it and decide they want to do it, or they're just put in the class. So it's sort of just become, it started out grassroots way, but then it's really just become a part of the district. And right now it's in grades 7 to 11. I think just 2 years ago, it was a dual enrollment class offered to 12th graders as an elective. So they have a very expansive program there. It's also a tiny school system too. I just need to note that.
I'm curious how similar or different these programs are to each other when you go from community to community or even state to state. You also went to San Francisco, which is a long established program. What were some of the similarities you saw to Holyoke?
Sure. And I would say I'm hearing some of the same things even in Boston. One is the emphasis on the history of oppression and resistance, the idea that they're not just going to teach about all the bad things that happen to different groups in history, but they're also going to talk about the social movements that grew out of some of those things, like not just civil rights, but Black Lives Matter movement and different movements. So that's one commonality. Another commonality is they usually start with the individual's history. Like they might have the students do an oral history on their own background. It's like, what is my identity? So they really have the students take a close look at their own identity or identities, race, gender, religion, that can come out of that. And then they broaden to lessons throughout history and the effect on marginalized groups in history. And then yet another common element is the youth research action project or youth research participation project. They call it different names, but pretty much every program, a big part of this is usually as a culmination, you're doing some kind of project on your community or on your school. It doesn't necessarily have to be about race and ethnicity, but it has to be something related to community or school.
What you're describing sounds like encouraging students to be engaged citizens.
Yes, it really has a strong civics component. And Holyoke, interestingly, they're embedding it into their 8th grade civics classes. In Massachusetts right now, it's a state mandate that all 8th graders take civics. And in Holyoke, they're combining ethnic studies with the civics class because it's just such a natural blend. So yes, if you talk to an ethnic studies advocate or an ethnic studies teacher, you'll hear them often say the word empower. Part of this class is about empowering students to take charge of their own education and kind of what they're facing and what their community and school is facing. So it has a really strong social justice, social activism aspect of it.
Did anything jump out at you as you visited these different districts in terms of differences in the programs?
Yes, but I would say that the differences often just relate to what is the racial and ethnic makeup of those cities and communities. And in Holyoke, what really jumped out at me is I walked into Daniel Hayes' classroom. She teaches ethnic studies at the high school level. And there was a timeline of Holyoke's history along the wall and the Puerto Rican diaspora. And she also throughout tries to always include some links to Puerto Rican history. even, when she was talking about Native American students and the ones who were put in the boarding schools and assimilation, forced assimilation, she added a connection that was to Puerto Rico when there was an English only mandate in the schools there. So in Holyoke, I would see those kind of connections. In San Francisco, I felt like they went a little bit broader. There's students in the room, while I would say as many as half were Asian American. There was a lot of diversity within that group, and then also a lot of Latina. So they weren't necessarily focusing only on Asian American history or the San Francisco history as part of that class. They would include some of that, but they went a little broader and more thematically. One more difference: the San Francisco class is an elective called Introduction to Ethnic Studies right now. It is going to be a graduation requirement. The Holyoke class is in place of what they had traditionally offered as a history class. So there still are some students who don't take ethnic studies who take a more traditional US history class. So those are a couple differences.
You mentioned that you were drawn to the story in part because you had seen research about how ethnic studies classes were impacting student outcomes. What did you find out?
It was really interesting. I looked at two major research studies that had come out on ethnic studies, one in Tucson and one in San Francisco. And both of them showed very similar findings that when students take ethnic studies, their chances of persisting in school increases. They graduate at higher rates than students who didn't take ethnic studies. Clearly, then that means they drop out at lower rates. Tucson study also showed the students did better on state tests. And then with the San Francisco study, they did a follow-up that just came out in 2021. And it showed that the group of ethnic studies students persisted in college longer than comparable peers.
Thomas G., the Stanford researcher who led that big study of the San Francisco Ethnic Studies program, he voiced concerns in your story about these kinds of initiatives scaling up too quickly. What is he worried about?
I think number one, he's really worried because there's so much care that it takes to create a really good ethnic studies program. It requires extensive teacher training. Teachers have to know not only how to manage the difficult conversations that are going to occur on race, they have to know content that they might not have studied themselves previously, like a much deeper history of different ethnic and racial groups in the US. And I think I'll come back to that managing difficult conversation thing. That is a biggie.
So, in a best case scenario, ethnic studies classes can give students a safe space to talk through complex and sometimes painful topics, but that can go wrong.
Totally. And I've written about this actually in the past, just in general classes about teaching about race. If a teacher has little knowledge or background, it can go wrong and it can hurt the students that this type of teaching was really meant to reach in the beginning, the students of color. Maybe the teacher's bringing a built-in bias. Maybe they're so worried about white students overreacting that they go too far in one direction that way. They may overteach victimization. They may teach only superficially. This is something that can happen. I think the biggest concern is that conversations can go awry. Students are going to say what they say, right? So you have to jump on it. If a student's saying something that comes across as racist or stereotyping, I don't know if you remember my story. I talked about David Coe, the San Francisco teacher, and his concerns about this and how he handles it. There was a student who was saying, "Oh, I can't believe how bad that grammar is of those students." And he was just sharing some past papers, and he addressed it. And he said, "Look, there are students who are learning English as a second language, and we have to be respectful," and that kind of thing. And trying to bring it back, I would say there was even a bigger case where a student made some kind of comment, well, like, aren't people from Korea and China the same? And the students were about to jump on their peer for saying that. This was a white student speaking in a class that was majority Asian American, mostly Chinese Americans, but there could have been a Korean American as well. And the teacher came back and tried not to, he talked about it's a balancing act. You don't want to make any student feel terrible. You want to be able to have open conversation, but at the same time, you want to jump on comments that may come across as bigoted. And so he explained the difference between Korea and China. And yes, they have different cultures and different languages. And he talked about that and talked about the importance of not making assumptions.
We're talking with education journalist Linda K. Wertheimer about ethnic studies programs and how to cover them. Don't miss an episode of EWA Radio. You never have to. You can find us on your favorite podcast app. And thank you to everyone who's taken a moment to rate us on iTunes. Your support and your feedback are helping us to grow. Linda, you have some original qualitative data in this story looking at graduation rates for students who were taking ethnic studies classes in Holyoke. How did you develop this methodology? Who helped you?
So number one, we only looked at Holyoke because San Francisco and Tucson, those studies had already been done. And the first thing I did is I did a lot of reading myself on previous studies about ethnic studies. And then I actually had very long conversations over Zoom with Tom D, who had led the study in San Francisco, and also Nolan Cabrera, who had co-led the Tucson study. And I talked at length with them, like what I was hoping to find out. I wanted to see, was ethnic studies making a difference in some way in Holyoke? And so we talked about the fact that you have to come up with a list of variables that need to be controlled so that you can have as fair as assessment as possible. And I came up with a list, and I also talked at length with an education professor from UMass Amherst who was intimately familiar with the Holyoke program. And we went through the list as well as like, what variables do we need to control to make this fair? And then with Tom D and Nolan Cabrera, I also talked about what are the best measures to look at. And we talked about dropout rates, graduation rates, test scores, and attendance as things to look at. I used the reporting fellowship money to hire a data journalism graduate student to help with the number crunching, and also used some of that to hire Aaron Doobie, an economics professor and data expert at UMass Amherst, to help as well, because he really understood how to do a really good regression analysis. I had to do a lot of homework on the front end to know what was the best way to do this.
I'm sure, one of the questions people will ask if you show something that a program had positive results on student graduation rate was, well, how do you know that the students who were in these classes weren't already more likely to graduate, especially if they were opting into the class? So were you able to control for some of that?
You can't completely control for self-selection. That's impossible. But the control variables that we did were designed to set up similar groups of students. We looked at where they were in 8th grade. So where were they in GPA, attendance, and other factors, and race and income and gender. So we could control for those kind of things and looking at the two groups. And we did have long discussions about this. And basically, when they're opting in, who opts in and why, that might involve a much more sophisticated study than we would have been able to do. So you can't 100% account for self-selection. But in talking with the professor at UMass Amherst, as well as Tom D and others, they still felt like with the difference we saw, it was significant enough to say, hey, no matter how we slice the data, it kept saying the same thing. They were graduating in higher rates than other students who did not take the classes.
I would say your story does not oversell these findings. I think you couch it really well, which is to say that these numbers are encouraging. Correlation is not causation, but certainly these indicators are pointing in a direction that suggests something positive is happening.
Exactly. Yes, we were very, very careful. And in fact, I would say that I probably spent, like on the home stretch of the story, I spent the most time on that, wanting to be sure that we didn't oversell what we had, because it was really exciting to see this big of a difference, right? But you also just can't say that that's the only reason that they graduate at a higher rate. What we could say is like, and this is where I think interviewing students is so critical when you're doing studies like this, the students back it up and will say that the ethnic studies class is what made a huge difference for them in high school. It created community for them that they didn't have in any other class in the high school. So that gave us a lot of confidence in even being able to say what we said, besides the numbers.
What did you learn from crunching these numbers? Do you have any tips for reporters who may want to try something similarly ambitious in their own communities?
Yeah. So one is, I would say you need to lower your expectations on what is possible. Originally, I had hoped to do the same kind of study in several cities at the same time, like Albuquerque and LA and other places that had had ethnic studies classes for a number of years. And the reason we had to lower our expectations, it is, first off, it's incredibly hard to get the district to give you the data in the first place. It took us a couple of months before we got it from them. And in some of these places, we can even get people to get back to us. So I would say, particularly, don't get over ambitious. Try and do what's doable. The other lesson learned, start asking for the data as early as possible, which we did do. Do your research beforehand. Talk to researchers. Talk to the school people as much as you can. And it's sort of counterintuitive in some ways because we're doing an analysis on a school district. But at the same time, we want to be sure that they agree with us that the data we're using and the students we're using is the right group of students. And even like 2 weeks before publication, we were taking some students out because it turned out there were 27 students who had entered high school freshman year, like some of them with only 11 days left to go the school year. So that would not be a fair group to measure against someone who had pretty much been there all year and taken ethnic studies. So that was something that came up later because they just gave us the data set and said, here's the freshmen, which is what we had asked for. So then we had to have a lot of discussions back and forth with who belongs in and who can we not include because it would not be fair. And if you don't have a good data person on your staff, hire someone. And we also realized we needed to hire a second person. So I'd hired Eureka Schumacher, who's a graduate student at Northeastern and very good, but she wanted backup to kind of check our regression analysis and all of that. And that's why we hired Erin from UMass Amherst. So it's just like, keep talking to the school system throughout, make sure you're on the same page, have good experts. Those would be the tips I have. And stay calm.
Calm is always good, Linda.
It's tough stuff.
I'm a big fan of calm. There are efforts underway by some conservative groups looking to limit what and how students are taught about race and racism right now. I'm curious, how do ethnic studies programs fit into this critical race theory debate?
In some ways, it's all connected, but in other ways, controversies over ethnic studies began long before we even heard the word CRT debate. The CRT debate, based on my research, is really about people who don't want students to learn about racism, white privilege, and things that could put a white student in the position of having to evaluate his or her place in society. So I guess the feelings behind the debate kind of match some of the debate that you hear in ethnic studies. And yet I would say that on the other hand, the debate over ethnic studies precedes it. It goes back to what happened in Tucson in the 2000s, where you had a state official saying this education's un-American.
Well, there's a new national poll out this week showing the majority of Americans actually want students to learn about race and racism. And so I'm curious, what has been the community response to these kinds of programs? What did you see in Holyoke and what did you see in Boston?
Holyoke, they've had no controversy since they've been doing this. And I talked to students like, do you talk to your parents about this? Yes. And they've done some community engagement. They often do a community event at the end of the school year related. So they do involve the community. I also interviewed some parents who said, yeah, they definitely approve of this kind of education. They're happy to see it. Understand that the school districts that I was focused on are majority minority school systems. And I do hate that term, but it's a shorthand. So Holyoke controversy within California, and I talk about that in my article, there certainly has been some pushback, but not in San Francisco. San Francisco's been at this for quite a while. I talked to the social studies department chair for the district. He said they've gotten like one letter from someone like in recent years. I think it was in the last year. And he wanted to know, how are you handling Israel and the BDS movement in the curriculum? And he just wrote a letter asking about it. But there hasn't been like nasty debate within the districts that I went to. There certainly have been some very huge controversies in California as a whole. And even working on my Boston story, and Boston has not moved as far on this yet as San Francisco or Holyoke. They're moving, and there are teachers going through training, and there's some teachers experimenting with classes, and they hope to roll out introduction to ethnic studies classes next school year. But already there's Jewish organizations asking questions. They want to know, how are you going to handle Israel in the curriculum? So that, interestingly, it's not the same as the anti-CRT debate at all, because nobody in the things that I'm describing is saying that they object to teaching about race and racism or even that they object to teaching about white privilege. So it's a different kind of thing. And no one's charging un-American right now that I know of with the ethnic studies classes. I'm certainly not in the cities that I've been looking at.
If I'm an education reporter and I get a chance to go into an ethnic studies classroom, what should I be looking for? Are there hallmarks of a great program and potentially some red flags?
First off, when you go in, you want to look at the content and what makes it different than a traditional history class. Is it really ethnic studies? Is the question I would be asking myself. And I went in knowing what the general characteristics were of ethnic studies classes, such as creating community in some way, studying identity on a personal level, but also historically, teaching about the history of oppression, but also resistance, and then having that activism aspect of it at the end, some kind of student project. So that's one thing to look at. Are they just including an occasional article by someone of color? That's not really ethnic studies. So that's number one. Like, are they really truly doing what people in the field consider ethnic studies? And in terms of what makes a good program, is it rich content in terms of what's happened historically and also modern day? Are they drawing links for students? The other, like, looking at the hows to me is like one of the big things. Like, how is the teacher actually teaching the material? Are they guiding students to an answer, or are they just giving them the answer? How does the teacher handle incidental comments and questions that come up? I'm just going to go back to one aspect there about guiding or giving them the answer. One of the huge criticisms of ethnic studies, and just even out there in general, when we're talking about teaching about race, is, are the teachers indoctrinating the students? Like, we hear that a lot. So that's something as a reporter you can look for. Like, is the teacher really expressing their personal view to the point that the students feel like their own view doesn't matter? That's something to think about. I also look at what's on the walls of the classroom and also at students' work. Are they writing at a sophisticated level? Are they using critical thinking? I think a red flag would be as a teacher saying, I think a lot, like I think, and or my view is. So, keep your ears open for what they're saying. Are they truly presenting both sides? And also, how are they handling things when students raise an awkward question or when there's an uncomfortable moment? Because there will be uncomfortable moments in the class. Those would be some of my suggestions.
Given that there are dedicated ethnic studies programs right now in just a handful of states, it's unlikely that most education reporters are going to encounter them. But certainly right now, race, racism, and ethnicity is a topic for all of us. What's your advice for reporters on this beat right now? What are some story ideas around these issues you'd like to see getting more attention?
One thing to think about is, in the aftermath of George Floyd's killing and the protests, many school districts and schools announced initiatives to do more in the curriculum on race and racism. They hired DEI officers. This would have been primarily for the 2020-21 school year, also affected deeply by the pandemic. So now was really the perfect time to see if you can do a follow-up piece on, what did the schools promise that they were going to do? What did they do? That would be one thing I would look at. Are they actually teaching about these topics more now than they were pre-2020? Another idea would be, there's plenty of anti-CRT bills, but there are also many states passing measures calling for more education about race, gender, diversity, the Holocaust. And I would love to see a story really talking about the opposite. What are some of the bills out there that states are passing, or school district policies? And then, sort of like piggybacking off of that, check out the graduation requirements of the high schools and the school districts you cover. How have they changed in the last few years, last 5 years, maybe even the last 10 years regarding ethnic studies, study about race? We developed a whole chart as we developed that interactive map with the online version. And it was really interesting about Boston, by the way, that graduation requirement happened really quietly. It was never covered by anyone in the news media here. I couldn't find a single story on it. And in fact, even the teachers who had been working so deeply on ethnic studies didn't know it happened until after the fact. And yet there was a news story about the graduation requirements. It just didn't mention that there was one about ethnic studies and race. So real important to look at the documents in depth. A fourth idea would be the rise of the DEI officers in schools. I've seen stories done about this in the higher ed level. it would be interesting to look at this at the K-12 level, because that was a real reactive response to the country's latest racial reckoning. So what do they do, and how long are they lasting? Are they burning out of these jobs? And then finally, ethnic studies oriented stories. It is on the table in a lot of school systems. Is it being discussed in yours? It could be a great local story to pursue.
Linda K. Wertheimer is a longtime education journalist. She's past education editor for the Boston Globe. She's been a Spencer Education Fellow at Columbia University, and she is a current EWA reporting fellow. Linda, thank you so much for making time for EWA Radio.
Emily, you're welcome. It was my pleasure.
And that wraps up another episode for us. If there is a reporter or a story you want to learn more about, drop us a line with radio@ewa.org. The mission of the Education Writers Association is to strengthen the community of education journalists and improve the quality of education coverage. For nearly 75 years, EWA has helped reporters get the story right. Have a great week, take good care of yourselves, and thank you for listening.